The room was dark and quiet when Vivian woke up. She felt her tummy hurt in a strange way. She looked at the clock. It said 3:47 a.m. Outside her fancy apartment in New York City, the lights sparkled like gold in the night sky. Vivian grabbed the soft bed sheets as the pain got stronger. She touched her sleeping husband's shoulder and whispered, "Julian, I think it's time." Julian woke up right away. His blue eyes looked worried but excited. He jumped out of bed, quickly putting on a suit he had ready. "Breathe, my love," he said, grabbing the suitcase he had packed earlier. "I'll call Dr. Maxwell. She'll meet us at the hospital." Their private elevator took them down to the garage, where their driver, Thomas, was waiting with the car ready. The drive to New York Presbyterian Hospital was fast, with bright lights passing by the windows. Vivian tried to stay calm, breathing the way she had learned in her baby classes. At the hospital, Dr. Catherine Maxwell, one of the best baby doctors in the city, was waiting. The room where Vivian would have her babies looked more like a fancy hotel room with a view of the park. Dr. Maxwell smiled and said, "Everything is going perfectly. The babies are in a good position." The next few hours were full of feelings. Julian held Vivian's hand but also made phone calls because the birth of their twins was big news for his business and family. As the sun came up, painting the sky pink and orange, Vivian knew it was time. Dr. Maxwell guided her with a calm voice. The first baby was born at 6:43 a.m., and the second baby came just 2 minutes later. For a moment, the room was silent. It wasn't the happy silence of everyone admiring the babies. It was a heavy, strange silence. Vivian, tired but eager to see her babies, noticed everyone's surprised faces. Julian, who had been by her side, took a step back, looking shocked. "What's wrong?" Vivian asked, her heart pounding. "Are my babies okay?" Dr. Maxwell nodded and smiled, bringing the babies to her. "Your babies are healthy," she said. Vivian looked at them. Their skin was pale, almost like porcelain, and their hair was so light it looked white. When they opened their eyes, they were a bright, almost clear blue. Vivian's heart filled with love and worry. She glanced at Julian, but his face was tight with anger. "That's impossible," he muttered, stepping further away. "Completely impossible." Vivian held her babies close, tears filling her eyes. "Julian, please." "Don't say anything," he interrupted, his voice cold. Then he walked out of the room, leaving Vivian alone with her newborns. As the morning light came through the window, Vivian stayed awake, watching her babies sleep. Dr. Maxwell came in with a worried look. "Vivian, we need to talk about the baby tests. There's something unusual." Before the doctor could finish, the door opened, and Maxwell Gray, Julian's lawyer, walked in with 2 assistants. He interrupted the doctor. "Any medical information should come to us first," he said firmly. The doctor frowned but left the room, looking sorry. Maxwell put a black folder on the table. "Mrs. Reynolds, these are divorce papers. Mr. Reynolds is offering you money, a place to live, and funds for the children's education after paternity is confirmed." Vivian's hands shook as she opened the folder. "Where is Julian?" she asked softly. "Mr. Reynolds is handling the situation appropriately," Maxwell replied. At that moment, the twins started crying. Vivian ignored the pain in her body and picked them up, holding them close. "Mrs. Reynolds," Maxwell said, looking annoyed, "this is a delicate matter. The press is already asking questions. You must stay quiet." Vivian looked at him, holding her babies. "Is that what you call this? Destroying my family?" The door opened again, and Vivian's best friend, Iris Washington, walked in. She was a journalist and looked ready for a fight. "Maxwell Gray," she said, pulling out a recorder, "any comment on the Reynolds family trying to hide medical information?" Maxwell left quickly. Iris hugged Vivian gently. "This is bigger than you think," Iris said. "I have sources saying this isn't the first time something like this has happened in Julian's family." "What do you mean?" Vivian asked, rocking her babies. Iris explained, "There are old hospital records, missing papers, and people paid to stay quiet. Julian isn't just denying paternity. He's hiding a family secret. That night, Vivienne made a choice. She sent a message to Julian's assistant. Tell him he can keep his money and his empire, but I won't let my children be a secret. The truth will come out. A week later, Vivienne moved to a small apartment in Brooklyn. It wasn't fancy, but it was safe. Iris turned one room into a research space, filling it with papers and a timeline about the Reynolds and Wright families. I found something, Iris said. Your grandmother, Beatrice Wright, worked as a nurse at a hospital in Louisiana. It's the same hospital where Julian's grandmother had his father. Vivienne felt a chill. Do you think it's connected? Maybe. That hospital studied rare genetic conditions, Iris said. There was a knock at the door. Dominique Laurent, a scientist, had come to talk about the babies. Their pale skin and hair are from a rare genetic condition, she explained. While Dominique talked, Vivienne's phone buzzed. The message was from someone named Martha, who used to work for the Reynolds family. It said, I know their secrets, Frive. Meet me at the lake in Prospect Park tomorrow at 10 a.m. Come alone. Vivienne whispered the name, Martha, as Iris started searching for more answers on her laptop. Martha Sullivan was 67 years old and had worked for the Reynolds family for many years, starting when Julian's dad was a teenager. But 3 years ago, she was suddenly fired, and nobody said why. I remember her, said Vivienne thoughtfully. She was always kind to me, but she looked so sad. Julian never mentioned her. That afternoon, Dominique was busy doing tests, and Iris kept investigating St. Mary's Hospital. Vivienne spent time taking care of the twins and looking at old family photos, hoping to find a clue. In one old black and white picture, she noticed something surprising. It showed her grandmother, Beatrice, wearing a nurse's uniform. In the background, there was a sign that read, Shh, Genetics Ward, Restricted Access. Dr. Laurent, Vivienne asked, what do we know about genetic studies in the 1950s, especially in the South? Dr. Laurent, the scientist, adjusted her glasses and looked serious. It was a difficult time, she said. Many experiments back then weren't ethical. They did things that wouldn't be allowed today. Suddenly, the twins' cries interrupted them. Orion had woken up, blinking his big, clear eyes at the sunlight. Vivienne held him, amazed by how beautiful he was. As she cradled him, she remembered Julian once mentioning that his father had health problems as a kid, but he never explained. Iris, Vivienne called out, feeling determined. Find out everything you can about Richard Reynolds when he was a child, his medical records, hospital visits, anything about St. Mary's Hospital. I'm on it, Iris replied, typing quickly on her computer. But the Reynolds family is very good at hiding secrets. Vivienne smiled a little. Luckily, I still have some old connections from when I worked in the family business, she said. That night, as the twins slept, Vivienne made a plan. She thought about Martha Sullivan and realized she might hold the key to all the Reynolds family mysteries. The next morning, Vivienne met Martha in Prospect Park. Vivienne arrived first, pushing the stroller with her sleeping twins, Orion and Celine. Martha came exactly on time, looking just as Vivienne remembered, strong and proud, even with her white hair tied neatly in a bun. Mrs. Reynolds, Martha said, looking at the twins with surprise. Or should I just call you Vivienne now? Vivienne is fine, she replied. Please, have a seat. Martha sat down, but her eyes stayed on the twins. They look just like her, she whispered. Like who? Vivienne asked, confused. Martha opened her old handbag with trembling hands and pulled out a photograph. She handed it to Vivienne. This is Richard Reynolds' first wife, Evelyn, Martha said softly. First wife? Vivienne's heart raced, but Julian always said his mom was Vivienne West. Martha nodded sadly. Vivienne West was his second wife. Evelyn was his first, but she died when Julian was just a baby, or at least that's what everyone was told. Evelyn had albinism, just like your twins. In the photo, Evelyn was a young, beautiful woman with pale skin and nearly white hair. She was smiling, holding a baby. She met Richard at St. Mary's Hospital, Martha explained. She was part of a secret genetic study there. The family kept the marriage a secret, but I was her nurse. I saw it all. Does Julian know this? Vivian asked, her hands shaking. No, Martha replied. The family made sure he never found out. They rewrote the story and made everyone believe Vivian West was his real mother. A group of ducks flew by, breaking the silence. Celine began to stir, and Vivian picked her up gently. Why are you telling me this now? Vivian asked. Martha took a deep breath. Because I don't want history to repeat itself. Evelyn didn't die. She was sent to a mental hospital in Vermont after she started asking questions about the genetic experiments the Reynolds family was doing. Experiments? Vivian was shocked. St. Mary's Hospital wasn't just a hospital. It was a place where they did secret experiments trying to change people's genes. Evelyn found out something terrible and threatened to expose them. Just then, a man in a dark suit walked by, pretending to be on his phone. Martha tensed up. They're still watching me, she whispered. But you need to know the truth. Look up Dr. Lawrence Bennett in Vermont. He knows everything. Martha handed Vivian another envelope. Here's all the information you'll need. Be careful. The Reynolds family has spies everywhere. Before Vivian could ask more, Martha hurried away. Vivian looked at the envelope. Inside, there were letters, addresses, and even an old note from Evelyn to Julian that was never delivered. Just then, Vivian's phone buzzed. It was Iris. Vivian, I found something in the hospital archives, she said. It's about genetic experiments on children in the 1950s and 1960s. The Reynolds name is all over it. As Vivian packed up to leave, she noticed a man with a camera taking photos of her and the twins. Her heart sank. Let's go home, my loves, she whispered to the twins. We have a lot of work to do. Back in her apartment, Vivian and Iris worked together. Iris spread documents across the kitchen table while Vivian fed Celine. Orion slept peacefully in his crib. I got into the hospital's old records, Iris said. Most of them were destroyed in a fire, but I found this. She slid a photo across the table. It showed a group of doctors in front of a hospital. One of them was wearing a badge that said, Dr. Richard Reynolds, Seymour. Julian's grandfather wasn't just a supporter of the hospital, Iris explained. He ran a program called Project Aurora. They said it was to study rare traits, but I think it was more than that. Vivian studied the photo, holding Celine close. What does this have to do with Evelyn? Iris opened another file. Evelyn wasn't just a patient. She was part of the experiments. And Beatrice, your grandmother, wasn't just a nurse. She was an undercover spy trying to stop it all. The intercom buzzed. Dominique Laurent, the geneticist, arrived with an elderly woman named Eliza Hart Chen, a former nurse at St. Mary's. Eliza Hart revealed another shocking truth. Your grandmother Beatrice discovered the Reynolds were trying to create a perfect set of genes. She worked secretly to expose them. Dr. Laurent added, the tests I ran on your twins show unusual patterns. Their genetics were altered maybe generations ago. Why would Julian react so badly if this is part of his family history? Vivian asked. Because he doesn't know, Iris said, showing a scanned newspaper article on her laptop. Evelyn wasn't the only one to disappear in the 1950s and 1960s. During those years, many people with special and unique genes mysteriously vanished. These weren't just ordinary people. They had rare traits in their DNA that made them different. And for some reason, anyone with those traits seemed to disappear shortly after being connected to a particular hospital. Eliza Hart, an older woman with years of secrets behind her, reached into her handbag. Her hands trembled as she pulled out an old yellowed envelope. It looked fragile, like it had been carried around for years. She held it tightly for a moment, then handed it to Vivienne. Beatrice gave this to me before she died, Eliza Hart said, her voice low but steady. She wanted me to hold on to it. Inside are pictures, records, notes, proof of the experiments. Beatrice had planned to tell the world about everything to expose the truth, but she never got the chance. Vivian looked up, curious. Why didn't she? She asked. Eliza Hart's face grew sad. Because, she started, but then stopped for a moment. Because she died in a car accident, or at least that's what everyone was told. Vivian felt her chest tighten. A car accident, she repeated. She remembered her father telling her something about it a long time ago. Eliza Hart leaned in closer, her voice barely a whisper now. It wasn't an accident. The Reynolds family made sure it looked like one. They didn't want anyone finding out the truth. As Eliza Hart spoke, Orion, Vivian's baby boy, began to cry. His little wails filled the room. Vivian quickly picked him up and held him close, trying to soothe him. But as she did, something caught her attention. His eyes. They were the same light blue as always, but now, in the right light, they looked almost transparent. So pale, they almost didn't seem real. Vivian froze for a moment, staring at her baby's eyes. Then, a memory came rushing back. She turned to Eliza Hart, who had just opened the envelope. His eyes, Vivian murmured. They look just like. She trailed off, but Eliza Hart seemed to know what she meant. Look at this, Eliza Hart said, pulling out a photograph from the envelope. It was old and grainy, showing a young woman with those same pale blue eyes. Underneath the picture, a label read, Subject A7. Vivian felt her heartbeat quicken. Orion has the same eyes as her, she whispered. Dr. Laurent, who had been sitting quietly nearby, leaned forward to look at the photo and then at Orion. The genes, he said softly. They don't disappear. They can hide, sometimes for many generations, but they're always there waiting. And eventually, they find a way back. Vivian felt a shiver run down her spine. She had always known there was something special about her twins, Orion and Celine, but she hadn't realized just how deep it went. Suddenly, her phone buzzed. The sound startled her, pulling her out of her thoughts. She picked it up and looked at the screen. The message was from an unknown number. Her eyes widened as she read it. Evelyn is alive. St. Clair Asylum in Vermont. Come quickly. She doesn't have much time. For a moment, Vivian just stared at the message, her mind racing. Evelyn? She said aloud. She's alive? Eliza Hart's head snapped up. St. Clair Asylum, she repeated, her tone sharp. Vivian nodded, still holding her phone. It's in Vermont. Do you know it? Iris, who had been sitting in the corner with her laptop, quickly started typing. I'll look it up, she said. After a moment, she added, it's a private hospital. Guess who owns it? A subsidiary of the Reynolds companies. Of course, Vivian thought. It all came back to the Reynolds family. We have to go there, Vivian said firmly. Eliza Hart frowned. That won't be easy, she said. Julian is probably watching your every move. If you leave, he'll know. Vivian felt her frustration bubbling up. Then what do I do? If Evelyn knows something, I have to find her. She might have answers. Answers that could protect my children. Eliza Hart thought for a moment, then gave a small smile. I have friends, she said. People who want the truth to come out as much as we do. They can help us get there without Julian knowing. Iris chimed in. And I can keep the twins safe while you're gone, she offered. I'll turn my apartment into a fortress. Security cameras, guards, whatever it takes. Vivian looked at her babies, her heart aching at the thought of leaving them even for a little while. But she knew she didn't have a choice. The truth was out there, and she needed to find it, for their sake. She bent down and kissed Orion and Celine on their foreheads. Mommy will be back soon, she whispered. I promise. Eliza Hart and Vivian began to plan their journey. It would be dangerous, but they had no other option. Eliza Hart reached out to her network of old friends, former nurses, doctors, and other staff who had worked at the hospital and knew its dark secrets. With their help, they mapped out a route that would take them to Vermont without being noticed. But as they planned, none of them realized that someone was already listening. Hidden in a lampshade in Vivian's apartment was a tiny listening device, a bug planted there without her knowledge. In a room across town, a man listened to their conversation through headphones. He picked up his phone and made a call. "Mr. Reynolds," the man said. "She's going to Vermont. She's found Evelyn." Back in the apartment, Vivian and Eliza Hart finalized their plans. They would leave the next morning, driving through back roads to avoid being followed. Eliza Hart had even prepared a fake identity for Vivian. "From now on, you're Claire Bennett," Eliza Hart said, handing her a fake ID. "You're a social worker investigating irregular admissions to psychiatric hospitals. It's the perfect cover." Vivian nodded, her determination growing. She held her babies one last time, then packed her things. As she prepared to leave, Iris handed her a small device. "It's a recorder," Iris explained. "Practically invisible. If Evelyn tells you anything, we'll have proof." With everything in place, Vivian and Eliza Hart set out on their journey. It was a long drive, and every car that passed them made Vivian's heart race. She kept glancing over her shoulder, certain they were being followed. At one point, she thought she saw someone taking pictures of them at a gas station, but Eliza Hart reassured her it was just her nerves. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they arrived at St. Clair Asylum. The building was old and eerie, with dark stone walls and windows that looked like prison bars. It reminded Vivienne of something out of a scary movie. Eliza Hart used her old nurse's badge to get them inside. After some quick thinking, she managed to schedule a meeting with Evelyn under their fake identities. The nurse at the front desk led them to a small, plain room. Inside, an elderly woman with white hair sat in a wheelchair by the window. "Evelyn," Vivienne said softly. The woman turned to look at her. Her eyes, the same pale blue as Orion's, seemed to sparkle with recognition. "You have his eyes," Evelyn said, her voice rough from years of silence. "Richard's eyes, but yours have kindness in them." Vivian opened a metal box and found old photos and a diary. The diary was written by Richard Sr. and started in 1950. It said, "With Project Aurora, we can find the best genes and even change them. Nature gave us tools, and it's our job to use them wisely." Vivian and Eliza Hart found a folder marked Phase 2, Early Intervention. Inside, they saw records of experiments on pregnant women and babies. Eliza Hart said they wanted to create a special type of person, but the results were unexpected. Some babies turned out different. Suddenly, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Vivian quickly took pictures of the documents on her phone, and Eliza Hart packed some papers in her bag. The door burst open. Maxwell Gray, the Reynolds family lawyer, entered with 2 guards. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said, "I didn't think you'd go this far." Vivian held the box tightly. "It's over, Maxwell. I know everything about Evelyn, the experiments, and what you did to Julian." Maxwell walked closer. "You only know pieces of the story," he said. "This is about evolution and progress." "Progress?" Vivian shouted. "You call experimenting on babies and mothers progress?" "Every advance has a price," Maxwell said. "The Reynolds family understood that long ago. That's why we've stayed on top for generations." Suddenly, Julian appeared at the door, his face angry. "You've gone too far, Vivian," he said. "Some things should stay hidden. You don't even know the truth about your own birth." Vivian snapped back. "I know what they did to you, Julian. Ask Maxwell about Evelyn and Project Aurora. Ask why our children are the way they are." Maxwell signaled the guards to grab them, but Eliza Hart pulled out a small device. "One more step," she warned, "and I'll send these files to every newspaper in the country." Just then, they heard police sirens. Iris, following the emergency plan, had called for help. Maxwell and the guards backed off. "This isn't over," Maxwell said as he left. Julian stood still, staring at the documents. "You're right," Vivian said. "This is just the beginning." Later, in a New York Times conference room, Vivian sat with Iris and the newspaper's legal team. "The documents are real," Elijah Grant, a forensic expert, confirmed. "This is explosive." On a big screen, photos from Project Aurora showed secret labs, medical files, and the faces of people used in experiments. The biggest shock is this, Iris said, pointing to a document. It detailed Evelyn's pregnancy, Julian's biological mother. They changed his genes before he was born. Vivian's phone buzzed. Eliza Hart had sent a message. Evelyn wants to talk to Julian. She says it's time for the truth. The door opened and Julian walked in, looking tired. "Can I sit?" he asked. Iris and Vivian nodded. "I read the documents," Julian said. "I always thought my mother died when I was born. Vivian West raised me, and I never questioned it." Iris showed an old photo of Evelyn holding baby Julian. "Project Aurora wasn't just about studying genes," Iris explained. "They tried to create better ones, but genes have memories. The traits they tried to erase came back in your children." Vivian showed Julian a picture of their twins, Orion and Celine, sleeping. "They're perfect," Julian said, his voice breaking, "and I almost pushed them away because of fear, the same fear that ruined my mother." "Evelyn is alive," Vivian said. "She wants to see you." Julian froze. "Alive? All this time?" Iris explained. "Your grandfather kept her locked away to silence her. She knew the truth and wanted to expose it. They called her crazy." "Maxwell knew," Julian said angrily. "That's why he tried to stop me from finding out." The door opened again. Eliza Hart entered with a nurse pushing a wheelchair. Evelyn, thin and frail, looked up at Julian. "My son," she whispered. Julian knelt in front of her. "Mom," he said softly. Evelyn touched his face with trembling hands. "Yeah, you have your father's eyes, but my heart." Vivian wiped away tears as Julian and Evelyn embraced. "We have to tell the world," Iris said. "No more secrets." "Yes," Julian agreed. "It's time for the Reynolds family to face the truth." Evelyn smiled. "Your children, my grandchildren, are proof that love is stronger than experiments." The next day, the New York Times ran a huge story. The Reynolds dynasty exposed. Photos and documents revealed decades of genetic experiments. Calls flooded Vivian's phone, but she focused on her family. Julian holding Orion, Evelyn cuddling Celine, 3 generations together for the first time. Iris entered with newspapers. Reynolds' stock dropped 30%. The board is panicking. Maxwell fled the country on a private jet. Julian looked determined. "We have enough evidence to bring him to justice," he said. Evelyn, calm and dignified, said, "The empire your grandfather built was rotten. It's time to build something better." The intercom buzzed. It was Vivian West, Julian's stepmother. When she entered, she froze at the sight of Evelyn. "You're alive," she whispered. Evelyn nodded. "Thank you for raising my son." Vivian West turned to Julian. "Your father is in the hospital. He had a heart attack after reading the news." The room fell silent. Julian carefully handed Orion to Vivian. "I'm going to see my father," he said firmly, "not to say sorry, but because he needs to face the results of what he's done." "I'll go with you," said Evelyn. "It's time Richard dealt with his own mistakes." As Julian and Evelyn got ready to leave, Iris's phone rang. When she answered, her face turned pale. "What happened?" Vivian asked, worried. "I got an anonymous tip," Iris said, typing quickly on her laptop. "The Aurora project wasn't just the Reynolds family. Other rich and powerful families were involved. There are more secret labs and experiments." Vivian West, who had been standing quietly, stepped forward. She looked like she had been keeping big secrets for years. "It's true," she said. "The Reynolds were only a small part of it. There's a whole network of families and companies doing genetic experiments." "Why are you telling us this now?" Eliza Hart asked, her voice suspicious. Vivian West took a deep breath. "Because I was part of it too. I was one of the test subjects, just like Evelyn, but I stayed quiet so I could live a rich and comfortable life. I've felt guilty about it ever since." Vivian looked at Orion, who was sleeping in her arms, and Celine, who was awake and watching everyone with her big, curious eyes. These babies weren't just proof of what the Reynolds did. They were proof of something much bigger and darker. "This is bigger than we thought," said Iris, still studying the new information. Much bigger, agreed Vivienne, but we'll expose it all. Every family, every experiment, and every victim. Vivienne West frowned. It will be dangerous. These people are powerful and will do anything to protect themselves. What's more dangerous is letting them keep messing with human lives, Vivienne said bravely. Just then, Celine began to cry, like she could feel the tension in the room. As Vivienne gently held her, she realized this fight wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about protecting the future, for her children and for all children. Iris, she said, get your team ready. Vivienne West, we need all the names you have. Eliza Hart, call every doctor and nurse you trust. It's time to stop not just one family, but the entire system. 6 months later, autumn leaves painted Central Park in gold. The final court hearing for the Reynolds and the Aurora project had just ended. The world had changed. Vivienne sat in the living room of their cozy new Manhattan apartment. It wasn't as fancy as their old penthouse, but it felt more like home. Orion and Celine, now almost a year old, were playing on the carpet, giggling and crawling around, completely unaware of the storm their birth had caused. Iris walked in holding a thick folder. The judge accepted all the evidence, she said. The executives responsible, including Maxwell Gray, have been sentenced to the maximum time in prison for crimes against humanity. Julian, who was playing with the twins, looked up. What about my father? Henry Dalton agreed to testify about everything, Iris explained. Because of his poor health, he'll serve house arrest instead of going to prison. Evelyn, who now lived in the same building, sat quietly in her chair, knitting. Her health had greatly improved since the truth came out. 50 years, she whispered. 50 years of secrets, finally revealed. The investigation showed that the Aurora project wasn't just about one family. It involved 12 powerful families from around the world. These experiments had been happening for generations. The scandal toppled governments, destroyed companies, and changed how people thought about medicine. And the other families? Vivienne asked. They're falling, one by one, Iris said with a small smile. Vivienne West's testimony was key. She opened doors we thought were locked forever. Julian's phone rang. It was from the new Aurora Foundation, created with money recovered from the families involved. Its goal was to help all the victims and support ethical genetic research. The first clinic opens next month, he said after the call. Evelyn, they want you to be the honorary president. Vivienne picked up Celine, admiring her silvery hair shining in the evening light. What about other cases like them? We found many, Iris said. Dozens of children around the world with special traits, just like Orion and Celine. Even after all the experiments, nature still found a way. Eliza Hart came in with more papers. The Medical Ethics Committee just approved new rules for genetic research, she said. They're calling it the Reynolds Protocol to make sure this never happens again. Evelyn put her knitting aside and looked at her grandchildren with tears in her eyes. You know what's funny? My father-in-law wanted to create perfect humans through science. But look at these children. They're perfect just as they are. Julian hugged Vivienne from behind as she held Celine. Orion crawled over and reached up to be picked up. I'm sorry, Julian whispered, for doubting you, for letting my pride and fear get in the way. Vivienne turned to him. I forgive you, but I'll never forget. Scars remind us where we've been and teach us where we need to go. Iris snorted. The Times wants to do a story about you, she said. The family that exposed the truth and changed the world. No, Vivienne said softly. This isn't just our story. It's Evelyn's story, Vivienne West's story. And it's the story of all the victims who lived in the shadows for so long. It's about how secrets can hurt generations, but truth can heal them. Evelyn stood up with Eliza Hart's help and looked out the window. The city was still as busy as ever, but something felt different. The truth had lifted a heavy shadow, showing that even the most powerful can be brought down when the truth is revealed. What do we do now? Julian asked, still holding his family. Now, Vivienne said with a smile, kissing Celine's forehead, we live. We raise our children with love and honesty, and we make sure the past teaches us, not traps us. Orion laughed, a sweet, happy sound that filled the room with hope. It was a promise that the future would be brighter, not because of science experiments, but because of love and truth. Evelyn smiled. The best inheritance we can leave isn't money or power. It's the values we plant in the hearts of the next generation. A year later, life found a new rhythm. Time magazine featured the twins on their second birthday. The cover showed Orion and Celine playing in their garden, their silver hair shining under the sun. The headline read, "The Children Who Changed the World." Vivienne, sipping coffee on the balcony, flipped through the magazine. It's still strange to see our kids in magazines, she said. Julian, looking over reports from the Aurora Foundation, smiled. At least it's for something good. Applications for our scholarship program are through the roof. Evelyn, who now spent her mornings with the twins, proudly announced, Celine learned a new word today. Truth. She said it perfectly. Iris walked into the garden carrying her laptop. You need to see this, she said, opening an email. More families are speaking out from Japan to Sweden. The truth is spreading. The Aurora Project changed our lives in ways we never imagined. Vivienne West, who now worked with the foundation, joined the group to help make things better. New rules for genetic research were being used all over the world. Even China and Russia agreed to follow them. What about Richard? Evelyn asked softly. Even after everything, she's still worried about her ex-husband. Dad is different now, Julian replied. House arrest and therapy are helping. He even asked to see his grandchildren. Vivienne's face tightened. Do you think it's safe? With supervision, yes, said Eliza Hart, who had come for her daily visit. The doctors think it could help everyone heal. Orion ran up to them, his light hair shining in the autumn sun. Mom, look! He held up a drawing. It showed stick figures of their family, including one in a wheelchair for Evelyn and another wearing glasses. It's beautiful, my love, Vivienne said, smiling. The drawing showed how their family was now built not just by blood, but by love and choices. I got an interesting offer, Iris said, closing her laptop. A company wants to make a documentary about our story. Not just the scandal, but how we became a family again. I'm not sure, Julian hesitated. We've already shared so much. Maybe it's important, Evelyn said thoughtfully. People need to see that healing is possible even after secrets are revealed. Celine, who was playing quietly, looked up. Grandma, will you tell us stories? She asked. Yes, dear, Evelyn said, her eyes watery. I'll tell you all the stories, the sad ones and the happy ones. They're all part of who we are. That night, after the children went to bed, Vivienne found Julian in the study. He was looking at old family photos. Sometimes I wonder if my grandfather knew what his experiments would cause, he said. He wanted to control nature, but instead, he taught us about being human. From the children's room, they heard Evelyn softly singing a lullaby. Downstairs, Iris and Vivienne West were talking about the investigation. Eliza Hart was writing her memoirs, which would reveal more about the experiments. It's funny, Julian said, pulling Vivienne close. Grandfather wanted a perfect family through science, but true perfection is in accepting our flaws and differences. Orion and Celine, with their unique traits, proved this. What once seemed like a threat to their family now symbolized hope. What do you think the future holds for them? Vivienne asked, thinking of the twins. Julian smiled. For the first time, they're free to find out for themselves. 5 years later, St. Mary's Hospital, where the experiments began, was turned into a memorial and research center. Vivienne walked through the new building with Orion and Celine, now 7 years old. The children, with their silver hair and sharp minds, were symbols of a new era in science. This is where I met your grandmother, said a voice behind them. It was Henry Dalton, thinner and older now, leaning on a cane. He was there as part of his journey to make amends. Dad, Julian said, tense but no longer angry. Time and therapy had softened the pain of the past. Evelyn, in her wheelchair, joined them. So many memories here, she said quietly, looking around the building where her life had changed. Grandma, Celine called out. Tell the story of the hospital again. Before Evelyn could answer, Iris appeared with a film crew. The documentary about the family had turned into an award-winning series about science and human rights. We're ready for the ceremony, Iris said. Vivian West is organizing the guests. The auditorium, once the wing where the experiments happened, was full. Survivors of the Aurora Project and their families had come from around the world. Welcome to the Aurora Memorial Center, Vivian said in her speech. This place, once full of pain, is now a beacon of hope. It reminds us of the importance of kindness in science. Julian added, the foundation has found over 1,000 families affected by the experiments. Each story teaches us to do better. Orion, sitting between Evelyn and Richard, whispered, Grandpa, were you an experiment too? Richard didn't answer, but Evelyn gently held his hand. We were all part of something we didn't understand, she said. But you, my loves, are part of something bigger. You're part of the healing. Later, Eliza Hart shared her research. Trauma can pass through families, she said, but so can healing. Vivian West, now a spokesperson for the victims, shared her journey. We all carry pieces of this story. Together, we're writing a better ending. After the ceremony, the family gathered in the hospital's garden, now a place for peace. Celine played with other children who looked like her and Orion. Their differences were no longer seen as flaws, but as symbols of strength. You know what's amazing? Iris said, watching the children. Something so dark created so much light. That's the power of truth, Vivian said. She saw Julian talking quietly with his father. They were starting to mend their bond. Evelyn smiled as she watched her grandchildren run and laugh. The circle is complete, she said. Where there was fear, there is now love. Where there were secrets, now there is truth. What about the future? Orion asked, curious as always. The future is ours to create, Julian said. One day at a time, with love and honesty. As the sun set over the Aurora Memorial Center, Vivian hugged her children. She knew their story, the story of the Reynolds family, the Aurora Project, and everything that happened would live on. It would be a lesson for future generations to learn from the past and build a brighter future. This is just the beginning, she whispered, holding her family close under the evening sky. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.